Early war losses and the simple need to massively expand the carrier fleet at almost any cost had seen a vast swathe of programs put in place around about the time that the US was preparing to enter World War II. Everything from the expansion of the already underway Essex-class program to the similar expansion of the run of the first of many iterations of the escort carrier, to the last stage of these measures, the conversion of 9 Cleveland-class light cruisers to Independence-class light aircraft carriers that came about pretty much commensurate with the US entry into World War II courtesy of the Pearl Harbor attack. Whilst the Independence class were constantly being improved as design details were being refined mid-conversion and the lessons applied to later ships, several more carrier conversions were considered in early 1942 as the balance sheets filled with new carrier hulls on the slipways. Both the Alaska class and the Iowa class were considered, but also soon discarded. But the idea of a light carrier based around the hull of a Baltimore-class heavy cruiser caught the eye of Admiral King. This hull was larger than a Cleveland-class, whilst also relatively swift to complete compared to the capital ship conversion proposals. Moreover, since much of the Baltimore-class had yet to be laid down, the carrier could use the hull design as a starting point, but be built from the keel up as a carrier, as compared to having to work around an already partially completed hull. King reckoned that by early 1944 the US Navy would have probably lost 2 of the 9 Independences, and he wanted the carrier fleet, at least the light carrier fleet, to be brought up to strength. He also believed that these new ships would work best as fighter carriers, providing several dozen fighters apiece for combat air patrol over the main carrier force, which would free up the fleet carrier's entire air wings for offensive action. Since the first of the Independence class wouldn't enter combat until early to mid-1943, and reports on their performance and what could therefore be improved would take even longer to filter back, the new Saipan class, although it wasn't called that at the time, entered its design phase without recourse to these combat reports. The flight deck would be able to support heavier aircraft, but despite their best efforts, no space could be found for a battery of 5-inch 38 caliber heavy anti-aircraft guns, and so the designers were forced to settle for merely installing dozens of 40mm Bofors and almost as many 20mm Oerlikons instead. To save weight overall and make room for aircraft and their supplies, the armour was thinned to protect against 6-inch shells instead of the protection against 8-inch shells at battle ranges that the Baltimore hull originally came with, the belt therefore topping out at 4 inches, with a 2.5-inch thick armoured hangar deck designed to stop lighter bombs from getting deeper into the ship. This would leave the carrier displacing just a fraction over 15,000 ton standard displacement as completed, and capable of about 32 knots, courtesy of 120,000 shaft horsepower driving 4 screws. Although Admiral King had envisioned a pure fighter carrier, the actual planned complement was changed to 18 fighters and a dozen each of dive and torpedo bombers for an air wing size of 42 in total, which of course was the answer to life, the universe, and everything. Compared to the earlier light carriers, the island was made somewhat larger, and the position of weapons stowage was altered, with the torpedoes especially now stored deep within the ship, largely as a result of the loss of USS Princeton being attributed almost entirely to exposed torpedo stocks detonating after she'd been hit. Laid down in summer 1944 and launched about a year later in 1945, neither Saipan nor her sister ship USS Wright would see combat service. By the time they were ready for action, the war was over and their commission dates duly dragged, Saipan formally entering service in summer 1946 and Wright in spring 1947. They entered into a world where the US Navy's total strength was in freefall, as practically the entire pre-war fleet was being scrapped or sent into reserve, and even many wartime-built ships were being rapidly mothballed. With a surplus of fleet carriers, there was no further need for the light carrier, and only the fact that they were factory fresh saved the ships from being almost immediately decommissioned alongside many of the Independence class. But on top of the embarrassment of Essexes that the US Navy possessed, whilst the Saipan's just over 600-foot flight deck was fine for propeller-driven aircraft, the newer, heavier jets were rapidly outgrowing such an operational space. And so, after a decade of service, the two ships were decommissioned in 1956 and 1957. Brief consideration was given to giving Saipan an angled flight deck, but this was abandoned with only a project number assigned and no further work done. And instead, in 1962, Wright began conversion into a floating command post, and in 1963, Saipan became a communications relay ship, which was a very important role given that military communication satellites were at that point still something of an ambitious dream. These careers would last through the 1960s until by 1969 military satellite constellations had in fact been realised, and the need for communication relay ships was thought obsolete. With the floating command post role also abandoned, both ships would be decommissioned in 1970 and scrapped in the latter half of the decade.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.